Howdy, everybody. Shasta College, Humanities 2, as we journey through the humanities of the modern times from about 1500s to present. This is about our fourth week, I think, and we are going to just briefly cover um, some Eastern philosophies, Eastern religion, Eastern art. I'm going to really cover just briefly the Ottoman Empire, which was the main governing force of parts of Africa, parts of Asia, parts of Eastern Europe for over 600 years. They held a dominant force in the region when it comes to religion, values, culture. A lot of it was suppression. A lot of it was based on suppression. But I'll get to that in a minute. I want to talk about Essay 3, which I assigned the other day on Friday. The Dutch painters. I've already had a couple of questions, I think, uh, about the essay, and I think I clarified it again in the assignments. Look at the documentaries that I assigned last week on the two Dutch painters, uh, Rembrandt. Maybe you've heard of him. Hopefully, you have. Very, very famous painter, and another painter you probably aren't that aware of, Vermeer. And watch both documentaries and have your essay compare and contrast and analyze each of those Dutch painters who were painting relatively the same era in the Netherlands, Holland, Rotterdam, and elsewhere, and why they mattered, why they still matter. That's what the essay is about. Analyzing their work. And why do you think in that era and that location, the Netherlands, what was coming together then in the culture that produced these great artists who changed and shaped the world around us to this very day? Normally, sometimes I assign one or the other, but this time I decided to combine the two because I want you to look at both documentaries and try to understand each man and the difference and what made them matter. Good luck. 3 to 5 pages. So please, at least 3 pages. Thousands of pages have been written about each of these great men. So surely you could do three. Writing minimum and maximum pages on essays and assignments and research papers is very key to your college academic careers as it is. You'll have to learn to write these papers. Certain amount of page numbers. You might think it's arbitrary. It is not. When you get into upper division study, your papers will become longer, 20, 30 pages. When you get into graduate work, you'll be doing 50 to 100-page papers regularly. So this is a stepping stone to that. Um, so I'm not being rough on you by signing these brief essays. I'm trying to get you to critically think. These aren't research papers where you go to Wikipedia, it's copied down a bunch of info, and then copy and paste it onto your paper. I don't care where they were born or how they were born, unless it mattered in their art. Connect the dots to their birth, their education, uh, their marriages, their tragedies, their everything, their background, how they lived in the world is really important to try to understand. That's what created their art. And once again, like all great artists, we've talked about Shakespeare so far. Really, the only great artist, the other one was the religious Martin Luther. Um, these great artists are holding up a mirror to the culture they're living in. Think right now, who's holding up a mirror to our culture right now? How many of you watch TikTok? That's a mirror that's being held up. YouTube, social networking, that's who's holding the mirror up, for good or bad. Who are the great artists right now? Can you name any? Can you name one painter, contemporary painter? One. That means somebody who's alive still. Playwright. We're going to do contemporary painters and playwrights later as we get into more current times. We're not done with those. We're going to get into contemporary music also. Not yet. Maybe you listen to music. Do you go to museums? Do you just listen to the popular music, or do you go deeper than that? Maybe listen to music your parents listen to, your grandparents, or your older weird uncle. That's what this course is mostly all about, is trying to understand the culture in which these art movements existed. That's really important. So the Ottoman, going back to the Ottoman Empire, they existed with a lot of conflict. The world was always in conflict and in war. We still are, folks. The Ottoman Empire held sway of a large part of our Eastern culture for 600 years. Their group really failed during after a little bit after World War One. That's about 1922 or so when that was it. They had, for the most part, their religion was not based on Christianity. It was Islamic, Muslim population. Their money came from trade, and it was mostly spent on palaces, cities that they built. Maybe you've seen a mosque. That's typical Ottoman Empire architecture. A mosque would be an equivalent of a Western church. It's a place of religious worship in the Islamic world. I know you've seen pictures of them. If you go to page 97 in your book, which I hope you have by now, textbook, you'll see what I'm talking about in detail. I'm just skimming it. Their art and music, very influential throughout the world, but very different than Western art and music. Their music is actually based on a different set of notes and tones. That's not what Mozart or Beethoven was playing. Different modals of musical expression on different instruments. I'm going to assign a couple documentaries to watch, and you'll see examples of all that. And you'll see what I'm talking about visually and audibly. They had literature. They had prose and poetry, but unlike Western prose and poetry, in their prose, which is anything narrative, not poetry, they didn't have what is considered fiction. They didn't make up fiction stories. They're mostly stories that were nonfiction. Their poetry was different because the language that they were speaking, Arabic language, it has a different rhyming scheme. So it didn't translate throughout the Western world. When they, at their height of the power, they're very powerful throughout the world. When they started losing power, this is when Christians in their culture who were getting better educated started to surpass the Islamic Muslim culture because they weren't spending the money on education, they're spending on other things. They had armies, vast armies, and they later on, in the early part of this 19th century, they committed what is known as genocide on the Armenian people. That means they killed a lot of them. It's called ethnic cleansing. It's what Hitler did to the Jews. Ethnic cleansing. And to this day, there's bad feelings between the Greeks and the Turks and the Armenians because of the genocide. And to this day, their government don't admit to it. And that in lies the problem still. It's an ongoing issue that keeps those countries constantly in conflict with each other. It's a difficult, complicated area of study because we're not used to the terrain that it covers. There were other empires besides the Ottoman Empire, but that's the one that was sort of the key to this area of southeastern Europe, Western Asia, Northern Africa. From essentially the 14th century to the 20th century. When Shakespeare was writing Hamlet, the Ottoman Empire was in full swing. But this is long before we had social networking and the internet. And so the global village was not as accessible as it is now. So we're very isolated because of the distance traveled. But there was, for 600 years, there was interaction between the Eastern and the Western. And it mostly came through the Ottoman Empire. Yeah, in your textbook, go to page 78 through 97 or something, and that's essentially this where it's covered. You'll see. I haven't decided yet if we should write a paper about it or not, but it needs to be read about. You need to look at the documentary and you need to look at the textbook to get some context of what's going on outside of Western Europe, which is most of what we've been covering so far. What usually keeps cultures apart is ignorance of the other culture and fear of the other culture. Look what's happening now. The fear of what's going on in Afghanistan. Do you know anything about the Afghani culture? The Taliban? Besides that, perhaps fear based? Why do so many people, why are they in the Taliban? Or what are they afraid of? You know what they're afraid of? Western culture. Out of naivete, out of ignorance, out of unwillingness to understand other cultures. But Western cultures are guilty of it too. These are complicated things to comprehend entire cultures. Islam is complicated. To equate it down to a few simple, hateful, they're terrorists or they're this way or they're that way, they do the same thing, folks. And you don't like to be judged, either do they. So, through a long, beautiful, I was going to say some of it was beautiful, a long, beautiful, brutal history that ended in genocide. The empire essentially was over, had its day in about early 1920s or thereabouts. Look what's going on in Turkey. Is that we follow what's going on right now in Lebanon? It's collapsing. That's the old Ottoman Empire. Right now, it's collapsing. People are starving to death there. There's no electricity right now in the country. The banks have all failed. Their money is worthless. What's happened there? It's really deeply complicated. Their culture is failing. While we're all going to Starbucks and ordering our lattes and our espressos and complaining that they put too much whipped cream or not enough espresso shots, they're complaining about not having a piece of bread to eat. That's a real complaint, folks. And that was former Ottoman Empire, which at one time was hugely successful and rich, but it couldn't sustain itself. What can sustain themselves? Do you think Western democracy can sustain? It's being attacked all the time. Even from within the democracy, it's being attacked. It's hard to sustain any political ideal. So, when next time you look at the headlines, they say something about Islam or what's going on in the Mid East, try to do a little bit of research and try to understand the huge differences between East and West and not judge it from the perspective of ignorance or lack of knowledge. This is just a survey class, and so we cover these things or thumbnail sketches. So we're just going to touch down a little bit on this era, this important era, and this part of the world, which is still percolating with life and death and corruption and beauty and art, all struggling to survive. Hope your struggles are easier. See you next time.